we have developed our dualistic Cartesian way of thinking and living to the point where everything that went before was shut out. Mm-hmm. And now we feel threatened by it.
Yeah. Keep watching to learn more.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download all 8 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free, or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. Our topic today is the structure of consciousness. We're going to examine the extent to which those of us in the 20th century are influenced by the styles of thinking, archaic, magical, and mythical thinking that our ancestors hundreds of thousands of years ago experienced. My guest, Georg Feuerstein, is a Sanskrit scholar, author of translations of the Bhagavad Gita and the Yoga Sutras, and also an interdisciplinary scholar who has recently written an extremely fascinating book called Structures of Consciousness. Georg is also the director of Integral Publishing, a company located in Clear Lake, California. Welcome, Georg.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I might also mention you're the co-director of the California Center for Jean Gebser Studies.
That's right.
Jean Gebser is a Swiss poet and philosopher who's influenced your thinking enormously, and perhaps some of our listeners and viewers may be interested in looking into his work further, which was a large reason why you wrote the book Structures of Consciousness, was to introduce people into his thinking. But without getting into all of the scholarly details of what Gebser has said and hasn't said about this, I want to probe the structures of consciousness with you. Mm-hmm. One of the main points that you make is that we hold within ourselves in a latent form the various states and modes of consciousness, archaic, magical, and mythical states that were held by people in prehistoric times.
Mm-hmm. I feel that we recapitulate in a way the phylogenesis of consciousness that the human species has traversed through the last 4 or 5 million years. Mm-hmm. And it was Gebser who drew my attention to this fact.
In other words, just to explain for listeners who may not understand what we mean when we say recapitulate phylogenesis,
right?
That what you're referring to is that the fetus in the womb recapitulates or experiences all the stages of evolution from a single-celled organism up through the reptile stage to the human stage in gestation.
Right, and he does not do so only biologically, but also from the point of view of consciousness. So all the previous structures that mankind or humanity, if you don't want to have feminist slant here, traversed are in us, are co-present in our present structure of consciousness, which is, as Gebser told us, the rational structure, and I guess we all know that.
We think of ourselves as rational, and often we're probably not aware that under the surface of our consciousness we have within us all of creation in effect.
I wouldn't put it quite like that.
Am I overstating the case?
I would. Well, I'm not sure. I think from the point of view of, say, the archaic consciousness, that might be the case because the archaic consciousness is an identity consciousness. And from that point of view, you might say that, yes, we are one with nature or one with the universe, and therefore we carry the patterns of the universe in our body-mind.
Now, archaic consciousness is a term that you use to refer to almost like a dreamless sleep.
Right.
Perhaps the state that a newborn infant might experience.
Right.
And a state that maybe much of humanity experienced perhaps for hundreds of thousands of years in the very, very early days.
Right. I think that the evidence, the anthropological evidence, points to a period of several million years where humanity was really pre-human. There was no self-consciousness as an individual as yet. And you had a kind of a Euroboric existence, a womb-like enmeshment in nature, if you like.
Yeah.
And
Euroboric is an interesting term. Isn't that refer to the snake that swallows its own tail?
Swallows its own tail. It's the self-completion of the human body-mind.
A sense of wholeness, but a wholeness in its infancy.
It is pre-conscious.
Yeah.
It is a wholeness that is yet to be, almost.
And what you're saying, in effect, is that practically all of nature is in this state of consciousness.
No, I wouldn't quite put it like that. I would say that the human being is a human being because there is a measure of awareness that differentiates the human being from the animal kingdom. And in the archaic state, that modicum of differentiation includes an awareness of nature as part of your own being.
Yeah.
But it is still pre-conscious. There is not yet that differentiated sense of self that we have, and I guess we suffer and partly enjoy.
So the next stage of consciousness would involve one where there is some differentiation of the self.
Right. Let me recapitulate a little bit the history of this. I think that the first signs really of an awakening self-consciousness as we know it in the young child occurred maybe 750,000, 1 million years ago with Homo erectus, who was the first species to actually have fire, to have semi-permanent dwellings, to have a social life. And that is only possible when there is a self to bounce off against the other. And out of that grew a more consolidated ego toward the end of a long period of trial and error, really.
So the very first glimmerings of selfhood took place that long ago, and that's what may, in effect, distinguish the human species from other species.
Right, right. So as human history continued, that definition of humanness became more and more precise, or more and more what we understand it to be today.
It must be very difficult for those of us surrounded by all the trappings of modern civilization to really appreciate what life was like so many hundreds of thousands of years ago.
Right, it is. And that is, I think, why most anthropologists wouldn't even look at it like that. I think it takes a psychohistorian of the caliber of a Jean Gebser or an Erich Neumann or even a Ken Wilber to appreciate that there were these different states of consciousness that humanity animated.
Yeah. And we in our mythology often refer to the Garden of Eden as being this representative of this very early state where it was total innocence. There was no sense of guilt, no sense of right or wrong, no sense of duality, I suppose.
Right. Freud referred to it as the primal horde, in which there cannot possibly have been any guilt, because there was no ego to feel guilty. And it's interesting that the Hebrew word Eden actually means delight. The fact is, though, that it's only the ego that can delight or not delight. So it's really almost a misnomer. the innocence is very much something that we project into that period. I think it is simply a state of lack of differentiatedness.
Yeah. In other words, we only have a concept of innocence because we've lost it.
We have lost it, right. And that is strikingly obvious in the mythical structure of consciousness, which almost, I would say, coincided with the Neolithic Revolution, where one of the primary elements of the mythic consciousness is that desire to return to the womb. To return
Back
to
to
the
the Garden
Euroboric
of Eden.
state, the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
And so that is where you have the different traditions of salvation, of yoga, of spirituality. It is very seldom a matter of transcendence within the fully consolidated self-structure. It is more a matter of a desire to escape time, to escape the historical self.
Well, one of the criticisms that the Freudians have made of the whole mystical tradition is that it seems to be an attempt to recover this undifferentiated state in the womb, which the Freudians regarded as very primitive, an oceanic state of bliss.
Right.
But so what? They thought this is, complete regression.
Right. And I wouldn't share that particular opinion, but I would say that it is clear from the documents we have, say, from India, like the Brahmanas and Upanishads, that very often there was an overwhelming desire to escape from life, to escape into the forest, into the cave, and to find some form of unity that those people still intuited to exist within themselves. I think we have forgotten, we are so out of touch with that particular dimension, that Freud would come along and say, well, we don't even have to find that anymore. That we should rather sublimate all these impulses.
But what you seem to be suggesting is that latent within each of us, there walks the first Homo erectus.
Absolutely.
With that undifferentiated, totally beyond innocent state of consciousness.
Right. We find it in deep sleep, where we withdraw into a dimension of consciousness that we can hardly talk about. Gebser pointed to a very interesting phenomenon of what he called the nuclear dream. It's a particular kind of dream where, upon waking, you feel, or rather you know all the elements of the dream, but somehow you can't piece them together.
They make sense at the time.
Right. It's immensely meaningful to you. And you're trying to arrive at the meaning, but somehow the chronology doesn't work. You can't causally relate any of the pieces. And his argument was that it has to do with the fact that the archaic structure of consciousness is close to what he calls the simultaneity structure of reality itself. And here we can do a little excursion into modern physics, and I think we can appreciate that reality indeed has all the elements that you can imagine extended into the future. And so we can also appreciate from that point of view why it should be that today the past is very much alive in us, just as the future very probably is alive in us.
Quantum physicists would agree with you. They'd say the past and the future all exist in some kind of a hyperspace matrix.
Right.
And so our rational notion, our 20th century notion of time flies like an arrow is really in many ways a limited worldview based on Newtonian thinking, which is peculiar.
Right. It is the point of view of the left brain. And the left brain is something that has awakened only in the mental structure of consciousness, which in Greece broke through at the time of what is called the axial period, around 500 BC, where all these immense innovations happened. The Greek polis, the city-state, that finally broke away from the temple state of earlier times, the breakthrough of dialectics, dialectical thinking. Socrates could never have happened in the mythical structure of consciousness.
And in effect, most scholars would agree that practically all of the fundamental concepts that we are living with today were developed in ancient Greece, here in the West.
Right.
2,500 years ago,
right.
more or less.
They were developed there, and they were, in a way, repeated in the Renaissance.
Mm-hmm.
That's a remarkable thing, that these structures did not evolve simultaneously throughout the world. For instance, there was an initial breakthrough into the mental structure of consciousness already, say, 1200 BC in the Hebrew world. Mm-hmm. So the Greeks were late, and the medieval Europe was even later. It was 1250 AD in the Renaissance.
Yeah. But let's go back a little further. We've kind of delineated the archaic, the very, very
right.
primitive stage. And then after that, you speak of the magical structure, the magical stage or level of consciousness.
Right.
I find that's a fascinating stage, and it sort of emerges somehow from the archaic, doesn't it?
It is another impulse coming straight out of that chaos of reality. Chaos from the rational point of view.
Yes.
And it evolves through the archaic. So the archaic is not simply superseded, it is incorporated.
Mm-hmm. It's almost within the archaic is the seed of the
Absolutely.
Magical
right.
state of consciousness.
Right.
And as you describe the magical state, I suppose we might think of it as being akin to primitive shamanism. There's a sense in which the mind itself influences all of nature.
Right.
A state you've described as being akin to everybody's telepathic and they all know it.
Right. Well, I'm not sure whether they all knew it.
Ah.
I think it was still not that conscious.
Aha.
It was simply, I think, a primary form of communication.
Uh-huh.
And like we don't really, unless we become philosophers, we don't question our means of communication. So people in the olden days didn't consider how they were communicating.
So telepathy might have been a natural state.
A natural state.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And out of this grew the rituals, the totems, the fetishes, and so on that we associate with that period. Or am I jumping ahead again?
Right. I would put it a little differently. I would say that because self-consciousness was even more differentiated at that level. Mm-hmm. The object, the world, stood apart more. And so the two were bouncing off one another.
The self and the other.
Self and the other.
Mm-hmm.
And what had to happen is either you withdraw in fear because of the chaos that you suddenly are aware of around you, or you made sense of it. Yeah. It's exactly what we do.
Now we
structure our universe.
Mm-hmm. The image that I have is in the archaic stage, self and other are undifferentiated. They're like one. And
right.
Then as they begin to separate in the magical stage, it's almost like there's some kind of glue or something holding it together.
Right.
And
that's a good image.
That's the experience of connectivity or telepathy,
right.
The interconnection of they're not quite yet separated. And,
right.
and out of that is this sense of telepathic interaction.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good way of putting it. In the magical structure, mankind the task of mankind at the time was to control nature, which is what magic is. The word comes from mag, Indo-European root mag, meaning to make, to do. Mm-hmm. And it is a very outward directed energy. You have to organize nature around you through rituals in order to feel secure. And so in our modern times, we go through our own rituals, but we are not aware that what we are actually doing is animating an earlier structure of consciousness. We get up in the morning, we brush our teeth, we look in the mirror, everything has to fit just right. It's a ritual. And by that ritual, we give meaning to what would otherwise be an utterly meaningless reality surrounding us. In the archaic state, there was a perfect ecological fit between humanity and the natural environment. Mm-hmm. As time goes by, there's more of an interference. And today we know that rational structure has caused a tremendous upheaval in nature to the point where we are doubting our own survival. Yeah.
Well, today we live in a kind of a rationalist world where we think of the self and the other, the universe, as being totally separate.
Right.
Objects. Nobody thinks of themselves as being part and parcel of the rocks on the street.
Right.
But in between, after the magical phase, there's this other phase, the mythical, where the connection, I suppose, between the self and the world is now a little more distant than the magical, more perhaps symbolic.
It is more distant, and that is why it has to be more symbolic.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, it was symbolized primarily through emotivity.
Through what?
So emotivity, emotion, the whole realm of social emotion was created. It had to be created because there wouldn't have been any cementing of any of these increasingly individuated beings.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the gift, really, of the mythical structure to us. But when you look at our life from within the rational structure of consciousness, we are really neglecting that particular structure.
We talk about it as being just myth, as in a derogatory sense,
right.
Whereas these myths form the basic connectivity, our basic grounding with our reality.
Right, they were life-giving. Myths were life-giving.
Mm-hmm.
There was the whole element of the imaginative realm, the imaginative dimension, which is closely connected to feeling and emoting. And we are suppressing it, actively suppressing it through our education system, through our interaction in business and in daily life.
Yeah. Now, you and I have been discussing for some time our contemporary rational way of thinking. And I guess, to be fair, we've been a little bit derogatory about the limitations of that mode of view. But you also describe a stage that comes after the mythical, which you call the mental. And it doesn't seem to have some of these negative properties that we have been ascribing to the rational.
Right, it doesn't. There was a state of balance because the mythical has still had life in it. But what we have done, we have developed our dualistic Cartesian way of thinking and living to the point where everything that went before was shut out.
Mm-hmm.
And now we feel threatened by it.
Yeah.
And yet, precisely because we are actively repressing it, it emerges, as it always does. Any repressed material comes up somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are facing problems today, social problems, that humanity never, ever faced in the past.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've referred to the time of the European Renaissance, and you referred to the period of Socrates and Aristotle and in ancient Greece, and the early period of the Hebrews as being times when mental consciousness really fully developed. And you describe this as a balanced state. Is it one which sort of incorporates, in some holistic sense, the earlier states and then adds something to them?
It is a new form of integration, clearly. I'm not sure to what degree that was done deliberately.
Yeah.
It is simply because there was this transition out of the mythical structure. The being was rooted already in feeling. Feeling is always an integrating force that once the left hemisphere of the brain came alive, there was still enough connection to the right brain. But as time went by, the left brain started to dominate.
Yeah. My sense of this early phase of the mental period is where out of this mythical culture emerged what I would call the great questions. We began asking, what is good? What is true? What is beautiful? The questions that Aristotle, Socrates, the questions that the Hebrews posed amongst themselves, they were in touch with the basic existential issues. And I suppose where we have degraded our worldview from a mental view into a rational view is we use this tool of the mind, but we're no longer asking the great questions.
Right. And I think that's our downfall.
Mm-hmm.
It's as simple as that.
But you describe another stage of consciousness, and I think it would be useful to talk about it, the emergent consciousness, that we haven't finished our journey into the structures.
Right.
There's a sense in which perhaps we can integrate all of these previous stages, understand our growth, our culture, our evolution, and come up with something new.
Previously, all the structures were unfolding autonomously.
Mm-hmm.
Today, I think a new structure is trying to emerge, but I think for the first time in history, an effort has to be made simply because self-consciousness has reached a degree of evolvement that will make it necessary for the person individually to take responsibility for his or her own life, and to make a conscious attempt at integration. And you can either look at it from a Jungian point of view and say it is an individuation process that you have to take responsibility for, or you can look at it with Gebser and say there is this major force trying to assert itself, and you can either fall back into previous structures of consciousness or maintain your hold on the rational structure of consciousness and take the consequences, which is probably global disaster, or you can make a concerted effort to go beyond self-consciousness as it is defined within the rational structure. In other words, the theme of the new consciousness is very much a matter of self-transcendence without diminishing self. So it's no longer a matter of take flight to the caves and the forests, but it's very much a matter of taking your stand from within the structure that you find yourself, but go beyond that.
It seems to me, in a way, that Gebser and some of the other philosophers in this area represent the new cultural pioneers, because they are attempting, this enormous task of integrating all of human knowledge, our anthropological knowledge, our biological knowledge, our cultural knowledge, and our spiritual knowledge. And out of this integration, if it can be done skillfully, must emerge another synthesis, but I'm trying to think of another new recapitulation in some sense, a new understanding of all the previous stages.
Right, it has to be done from the point of view of consciousness. Mm-hmm. That means understanding, that means self-understanding, and not only in the sense that maybe Socrates had intended it, but I think something even more profound. Because today, I think for the first time in our history, we are capable of looking back on our history and say, these are the elements that make me what I am. So I can look within myself, I can look at my life, and I can see the structures at play, the structures that coexist, that animate me.
George, you're a Sanskrit scholar. You've looked at what might be considered the most glorious spiritual literature ever produced by humanity, and it was produced thousands of years ago at, I suppose, a Renaissance time for the Indian culture. Do you see that this future emerging consciousness will in any way be related to or will build on the insights of the ancient yogis?
I think it must. Mm-hmm. Simply because the entire Indian culture, with very few genius exceptions, is rooted in the mystical structure of consciousness, which is us, which is I and you. Uh-huh. And unless we come to terms with that within ourselves, and unless I think we take advantage of the tremendous contribution that the Indian mind made, we will falter. Uh-huh.
Georg Feuerstein, we're out of time. It's been a pleasure having you with me. We've really covered such a vast scope of human knowledge, and I'm so pleased with the way you've been able to integrate it. Thank you for being with me.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download all 8 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free, or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.